Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Okay, are there any questions before we start? Okay, for those of you who were not with us last time, a student suggested that if we could put the class presentation, move them forward, and I agreed with that. So we said we're going to have the first class presentation on November the 17th. And the way we're going to do it is there are three topics that you can do your presentations on. So what I decided is the first 5 groups. I think that I believe there are about, let's say there are 12 groups. So the first 4 will do their presentation on the first topic. The next 4 will do their presentation on the second topic. And the last 3 or 4 groups, if we have 12, will do their presentation on the third topic. So we're going to keep exactly the same groups. We're not going to change anything. Now, I believe there is one group missing, which is not listed on the group list, and I think it consists of 2 students who decided to join themselves together into one group, and that is, I remember one of them is Muhammad. Is Muhammad there? I guess he's not.
Michael. I think it was Muhammad and Michael.
Okay, so those are the 2. Muhammad, yeah, there were two in that group, I believe. If my memory serves me right. So that really makes the 12th group. So we have 12 groups. The first 4 will do the first topic. The next 4 will do the second. And the last 4 will do the third topic, will do their presentation on the third topic. So that's it. That's as far as the second and final class presentation would take place on November 17th. And hopefully we should be able to finish them in 2 sessions. If not, then we have to probably add one more session to it because we need to complete those class presentations. Okay, today we will hopefully finish this chapter. We don't really have that much. We pretty much covered a lot in this chapter, and we just have very, very few things that we need to shed some light on. And again, this chapter deals with the fall and rise of the state. In other words, the dominance, the significance, the importance of the state in the MENA region, not only from the economic, but also from the political and social viewpoints. They were pretty much supreme. They were pretty much dominant in all aspects of life, as we said before. However, things started to change. In other words, things started to get out of hand. And as a result, these nations, not all of them, but the resource rich, labor abundant, and the resource poor, labor abundant, had to borrow a lot of money to be able to continue with the huge projects that they had planned for. And this really led them to pretty much fall at the mercy of the global lending institutions such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, who obviously demanded that these countries go through a lot of economic reforms to try to put their economy back in order. In other words, they felt that the economies were pretty much mismanaged, and something has to be done to bring back macroeconomic balance. And that's exactly what happened. A lot of these countries had to ultimately um, embark on economic reforms or structural adjustments, as we sometimes tend to refer to them, even though they felt that the consequences of undertaking such policies could be very detrimental for the economic as well as the political stability of these countries. But at the end, they really had no choice but to embark on these economic reforms. We will explain in just a minute um, why there was so much resistance to these economic reforms. Why did it take so long for these countries to realize that their economies need to be managed correctly and efficiently? So, why did it take them so long to do that? And today we will discuss the reasons for that, for um, the reasons why a lot of these countries were pretty much, or a lot of them actually found a lot of resistance to embarking on these economic reforms. But before we do that, I just wanted to continue with what we were talking about in as far as the Egyptian economy was concerned. What was the Egyptian economy doing? How it started? Remember, it all started with President Nasser's ambitious agenda for trying to industrialize Egypt and put Egypt on the right footing in as far as industrialization is concerned. This was basically the main goal of President Nasser at the time. He was very much interested in taking care of this backwardness phenomenon. Uh, he felt that Egypt has the potential to move forward, has the potential to eradicate a lot of its poverty, and also has a potential to enhance and increase its human development in terms of education and health. So he felt that all what was needed was simply to put the elements, the various elements, together in such an efficient way that the Egyptian economy can actually take off. And he obviously pretty much sowed the right seeds. Uh, and we saw last time that as a result, Egypt was able to engage and embark on huge projects such as the Aswan Dam, the steel industry in Helwan, and other different factories and industries all over Egypt. Um, and he was able, obviously, to eradicate illiteracy. Um, he, in fact, had a surplus of teachers that he was able to send overseas to countries in the MENA region, especially to Libya, Tunis, Morocco, Algeria, Yemen. Uh, you find a lot of Egyptian teachers in a lot of the Arab countries. And the reason for that was simply because Egypt did have a surplus of teachers. And all of that is pretty much due to the fact that President Nasser pretty much felt that education was one important key to eradicating poverty and also to putting Egypt on the right track towards economic development. So, from that point of view, he did an excellent job. And I remember in Libya, we had basically some of the best teachers, and most of them were Egyptian teachers. So, on one hand, I think the Egyptian goal or plans or policies or strategy, whatever you want to call it, that did in fact work for those years, except, as I said, in 1967, because of the Six-Day War, a lot of the things pretty much went against what Nasser was planning for. And it completely destroyed his whole strategy. And as a result, he had to start all over again from scratch. So he was back to square one, especially when a lot of his infrastructure was pretty much damaged during the war. And, you know, he really had to allocate a lot of Egyptians' resources towards the military. That took a huge chunk of Egyptians' resources, which were previously geared towards social and economic development in the civilian sector. Now, the military sector obviously has to take most of Egypt's resources, and that did not vote well for the overall economic and social development in Egypt. So you can see the Six-Day War was a huge blunder for Egypt. And that was, again, as I said earlier on, uh, that that was one of the reasons why President Nasser tried to give or present his resignation to the Egyptian people, because he knew that he was not able to um, not prevent the war, because obviously there was nothing he could have done to prevent the war. In other words, Israel was pretty much convinced that was the only way to keep the Egyptian army under control, and to keep the Egyptian threat as far as possible by going to war and destroying the Egyptian army. So there was really nothing that Nasser could have done to prevent the war. But once the war started, Nasser was not prepared for the war. Even though, from his rhetoric to his people, he was always showing them that the Egyptian army was strong, the Egyptian army was ready for war, the Egyptian army can, in fact, enter a war and win a war. So all of these things came back to haunt him for the simple reason because he pretty much lost the war from the first few hours when the war started. So that tells you that the Egyptian army was pretty much not ready, not prepared at all. And as a result, he lost a lot. So, you know, this is basically one of the things that pretty much ruined Nasser's plans for economic development and social development. Now, when Nasser died in 1970, President Sadat took over, of course, and President Sadat wanted to make huge changes in the Egyptian economy. In other words, he felt that what Nasser was doing under Arab socialism did not work. And he felt that the Egyptian leadership should give more freedom to its people through trying to encourage the creation of civil society. And also, President Sadat felt that more political parties should be given the permission to form. In other words, having a single political party does not work for Egypt. So, President Sadat was trying to open up the Egyptian economy, was trying to have more foreign influence in Egypt than before. So the first thing he did, of course, he tried to keep a distance from the Soviet Union then. Now remember, the Soviet Union at the time, prime ally of Egypt. In other words, Egypt's weaponry, all of it came from the Soviet Union. All the factories, the raw materials, the planning, the engineering, all came from the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union was pretty much influential in Egypt. And Western Europe and the US had no stake whatsoever. And according to President Sadat, in order for Egypt to survive, he really get the then he can thwart the threat of Israel. Because after all, the US is an ally of Israel. And if the US give permission to Israel to start a war, Israel will never start a war. So according to President Sadat, he felt that, trying to changing sides will be a good idea. But he felt that he will only change side once he has at least captured some of the territory back from Israel. And once he shows Israel that the Egyptian army is strong, that the Egyptian army has become stronger, that the Egyptian army can actually enter a war and win a war. So he started the 1973 war, which is known as the Yom Kippur War, whereby the Egyptian army was successful in crossing the Suez Canal from the east to the west side of the Suez, and was able to capture a good plot of land back from Israel. And this was the first time that Israel was actually caught by surprise. And this was the first time that Israel actually ended up losing a lot of soldiers, a lot of military hardware, etc. Because in 1967, it was a very simple, clean war. Israel didn't lose much in 1967. But in 1973, Israel really felt the pinch. And if it wasn't for you,
Professor, your microphone keeps cutting out every once in a while.
No, we can't hear you.
you cannot hear me?
Now we can. Okay.
Okay, let me see if I can make it a little bit more louder. I think it's very loud right now. I can see it.
That wasn't the
I
problem,
don't think
Professor.
I don't think it's the volume. It might just be like the cord plugged into your computer might be not all the way in. I
No,
feel like
it's all
that's
the way.
my solution when I have an issue with my microphone.
Yeah, it's all the way in. I don't see anything. Well, anyway, can you hear me now? Is it better?
Yes.
Okay.
Right now it's perfectly clear.
Okay.
Quick question, Professor.
Yes.
Why do they call it the Yom Kippur War? Was it fought during Yom Kippur? Is that
Yes.
why?
Yes, it
Okay.
was fought during Yom Kippur.
Okay.
And, so the war, the 1973 war, was a smart move actually by Sadat. And the reason why it was a smart move because it it gave Israel the impression that they can't enter every war and hope to win every war. So now the U.S. under then the Foreign Secretary Henry Kissinger, they tried to get some sort of a peaceful solution, and they brokered a uh, peace agreement between Egypt and Israel. And that obviously ended the war. It stopped the war because the war was not only on the Egyptian side, but it was on the Egyptian as well as on the Syrian side. So both Syria and Egypt were involved in that war. And there was a peace that was brokered by Henry Kissinger, and both sides, signed to the peace agreement. And from then on, of course, Israel was able to give back a lot of the land that they captured in 1967 from Egypt. Because before, remember, before 1973, Egypt could not operate the Suez Canal because half of the Suez Canal was under Egypt and the other half was under Israel. So obviously, Egypt lost a huge asset in getting fees from all the ships that use the Suez Canal. So obviously, getting back the Suez Canal was a huge bonus for Egypt. So this is one of the things that Egypt was able to get from signing the peace agreement with Israel. Now remember, it's only Egypt that signed that peace agreement. Syria did not. Syria only agreed to a ceasefire between the two sides, but they did not sign any peace agreement. So it was actually Egypt and Jordan. Both of those countries actually signed peace agreements with Israel. Now, Egypt, of course, was not only able to get the Suez Canal back, but was also able to get a huge chunk of the Sinai Desert from Israel. And the Sinai, of course, has a lot of oil wells that Egypt was able to get back from Israel. So that brought a lot of oil revenues to Egypt as well. Plus, of course, what Sadat wanted to go further than that by simply visiting Jerusalem. And this was a historic visit by an Arab president to go and visit Jerusalem and to give a speech in the Israeli Knesset, Israeli parliament, saying that Egypt was actually ready for peace and that there should be no more war between the two nations and so on and so forth. So it was a long speech that President Sadat gave to the Israeli Knesset, and as a result, the war chapter was pretty much closed between Israel and Egypt. Now,
I'm curious,
what
Professor, did that speech take place in 1974 or like right after that war?
No,
When was that speech?
no, I think that speech was, I believe, in 1978, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, that speech was 1978. It was after the 1973 war. Because remember, after the 1973 war, there was simply ceasefire. So that took some time. They only had a ceasefire. And then you had Foreign Secretary Kissinger pretty much going um, between the two countries, trying to get the two countries agree on a peace treaty. And that was obviously agreed on in the U.S. in the which is known as the Camp David Accord. It was obviously signed in the U.S. in Camp David under U.S. leadership under President Clinton at the time. No, I'm sorry, not under President Clinton. I think it was under. I'm not sure. I think it's under. Yeah, I think it was under President Clinton, if my memory serves me right. It was somewhere in the 1980s that, the peace treatment, 1979 maybe, somewhere around there, because I know that President Sadat passed away in 1981. He was assassinated late 1980, I guess, early 81. Again, I don't remember.
Wouldn't that be Carter then? Because 1970.
Yeah, I think it's probably Carter, right? Yeah. And then President Clinton took over, I guess, the rest of whatever it is that they were not able to complete. But yes, I think you're right. It was under President Carter. And then President Clinton sealed the whole deal, I guess, later on. So, anyway, to make the story short, that's what happened between Egypt and Israel. Now, obviously, Egypt benefited tremendously from this in the sense that they were able to open the Suez Canal, get all the revenues from the Suez Canal, be able to put the oil production in the Sinai back to normalcy, and were able to get a lot of revenues from selling oil. And they were also able to reduce their heavy expenditure on the military, because now there's no reason for them to be spending any more money on the military since they have signed this peace agreement. And if there is peace agreement with Israel, then with whom is Egypt going to go to war? Obviously, no one. Therefore, it really helped them in that sense. Now, you may ask the question now, okay, what's the benefit to Israel from all of this? What is Israel benefiting from this? Obviously, the one benefit that Israel got from all of this was isolating Egypt from the rest of the Arab world. Because remember, Egypt is the largest Arab country, not in terms of land, it's not the largest, but in terms of population, manpower, etc. Industries, economy. At the time, Egypt was, a strong Arab country. And by taking out Egypt from the equation, Israel felt a lot more safer because the Arabs will never wage a war without Egypt. It's extremely difficult to do that. So now taking Egypt out of the equation, isolating Egypt from the Arab world, obviously opened the doors for Israel to be more confident about itself and also be able to use a lot of the resources towards the civilian sector rather than the military sector. So Israel was able also to gain from that as well. And also Israel was able to gain as a result of US aid. In other words, the US said that if Israel signs this peace treaty with Egypt, then Israel can actually expect to get more help from the US. And I guess, the aid, the economic aid or the economic package that increased by probably about 35%. So, Israel gained from that peace treaty, of course. So there was a win-win situation for both parties. And however, President Sadat was assassinated in 1980 as a result of the peace treaty. And the same thing, by the way, in Israel. Prime Minister Rabin, he was also assassinated in Israel by simply signing a peace treaty and giving up a lot of the land back to Egypt. So you can see that the people, the leaders may be ready for peace, but the people, I don't think they're ready for peace. This is something that I said, if you remember, 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, when I said it's very, very difficult to see peace actually taking place between Israel and the Arab countries. And the reason for that is simply because the people are not ready for that peace. Excuse me. And President Mubarak took over from President Sadat in 1981. And in the early 80s, President Mubarak reign during the 80s was pretty much focused on restructuring the Egyptian economy. In other words, President Mubarak had very, very similar ideas to that of Sadat. He was pretty much contrary to President Nasser's policies. All of the policies that were pursued by Mubarak were very much contrary to those of President Nasser. They were very, very similar to President Sadat. So Sadat and Mubarak had very, very similar views, similar philosophies, similar ideologies. In other words, both of them pretty much wanted to restructure the Egyptian economy, uh, move away from Arab socialism, and try to bring in a market economy to Egypt. In other words, give more space to the forces of demand and supply to actually determine how resources are to be allocated in Egypt, rather than having the state be the supreme and the state be the sole determinant of how resources are to be allocated. So President Mubarak simply continued the policies of President Sadat. And President Mubarak also pretty much strengthened the relationship with Israel more than President Sadat. He went a little bit overboard in extending a lot of the relationships that Egypt has with Israel, so as to make sure that, again, the peace treaty will be adhered to, and that there will be no war between the two countries. So Mubarak pretty much was in favor of that. And however, the, uh, uh, the Egyptian economy under Mubarak went through a lot of crises. One of the crises that the Egyptian economy was under was simply it pretty much made the the Egyptian economy to be a service-oriented economy, and also to focus more on petty trade. In other words, Hosni Mubarak felt that the only way to keep the Egyptians happy is to enable them to consume more goods and services, to enable them to buy more goods from overseas, and to enable them to embark in what we call petty trade. So this is basically what was taking place in the Egyptian economy. In other words, Hosni Mubarak really did not pay much attention to the infrastructure in Egypt. He did not pay much attention to the industrialization process. All of that to Hosni Mubarak was really not in his agenda, basically. All what he was interested in was to stay in power and to have the Egyptian people happy, to give them the freedom to trade with the outside world, give them the freedom to buy whatever they want from outside, no restrictions whatsoever, and increase their consumption, basically. So this is what President Mubarak was interested in. In fact, all of this came to haunt Mubarak later on when the oil prices, of course, fell tremendously during the 80s. That's number one. And the other thing, of course, that pretty much went against the Egyptian economy was the huge decline in the remittances received by Egyptian workers who were working in other countries in the MENA region. Because after Egypt signing the peace agreement with Israel, a lot of the Arab countries pretty much boycotted Egypt. In other words, Egypt was also boycotted from the Arab League. They lost their membership in the Arab League for a while. So, Egyptian workers, Egyptian teachers were pretty much were prevented from working in a lot of the Arab countries in the MENA region. And as a result, remittances of Egyptian workers fell tremendously So that was a huge,
Professor, I have a question.
yes.
Are the remittances from the Egyptian government to the workers working overseas, or are they from the governments of the countries that their workers are working in? It's like, does Egypt pay its workers to work in other places, or
No,
is it the other government that pays them?
it's the other government that pays them. So all these remittances, they come to Egypt. In other words, a lot of these Egyptian workers send most of their income back home. Now, obviously, once they have lost their jobs in most of these Arab countries, the income, which is close to about, I think they were getting somewhere around $3 billion a year through remittances. And they obviously lost all of that. So this was a huge problem for Egypt. In other words, things pretty much started going wrong for Egypt, um, simply because of the oil glut during the 1980s, the huge fall in oil revenues, um, the terrorist incidences that took place in Egypt in 1985 and 1986 by the Muslim Brotherhood, or the extremist wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, who are obviously becoming now more dominant in the Egyptian political life, simply because Sadat obviously opened the door for them. And the reason why Sadat opened the door for the Muslim Brotherhood, because he felt that they would work as a deterrent force, if you will, to those followers of Nasser. Because when Nasser died, he had a lot of followers, and he had a lot of people in high political places. And the Arab Socialist Union was still very powerful, even during the reign of President Sadat. So President Sadat was not able to completely eliminate all of this. So in order for him to have some sort of power balance, if you will, he felt that, well, if he could open the door for the Muslim brotherhoods, they could actually be a deterrent to Nasser's followers, and as a result, bring in some sort of a political balance in Egypt. Now, obviously, as they became more forceful and as their power extended, simply because of the permissions and rights that were given to them by President Sadat, because a lot of them were in jail. Now, President Sadat took them out of jail, and he gave them the right to participate in the political process and to form parties and what have you, and organizations. And they did exactly that, and they're very well organized. The Muslim Brotherhood are extremely organized. They know exactly what they're doing. They have a lot of money, a lot of resources, and a lot of experience. And so they were able actually to be a force to be reckoned with in Egypt. And as a result, obviously, during the Mubarak era, the Muslim Brotherhood became extremely strong, and President Mubarak now began to think otherwise, and he felt that it's time to start putting some of these people back in jail. It's time to start putting the screws on. It's time to start going over their books and finding out if their books are legitimate or not. So, you know, President Mubarak tried to do all of that, and all of this obviously backfired. It led to some groups within the Muslim Brotherhood to become very extreme and take matters into their own hands, and became violent. And as a result, this did not vote very well for Egypt, simply because Egypt is a tourist place, and Hosni Mubarak did everything he could to expand the tourism sector, because a lot of tourists come to Egypt every year, and that's an extremely important source of revenues for Egypt. But when you have this political instability, and when you have these terrorists placing bombs in restaurants, in movie theaters, everywhere, I mean, this is something not going to attract tourists to come to Egypt. So this was a huge problem. Tourism was a huge problem. I'm sorry, terrorism was a huge problem for Egypt. And all of this obviously culminated in a recession in Egypt. And it also led to the government spending more on the Egyptian economy in terms of welfare programs, etc. Because remember, there's a lot of poverty in Egypt. You know, the I don't know if some of you have seen this maybe on videos or were able to see exactly the type of life a lot of Egyptians live. It's a stricken poverty. In other words, you find a lot of people living in cemeteries. They make cemetery their homes. And this is something that I don't know. No one would accept to see the level of living conditions stoop so low. But that's exactly what you have in Egypt. In other words, the poverty. It's the rate of poverty is very high in Egypt, and you really didn't see that during President Nasser. I mean, there was some poverty, yes, but not to the extent that you see it during Hosni Mubarak's reign. During Hosni Mubarak's reign, poverty accelerated so much that it became uncontrollable. And the distribution of income was pretty much tilted towards the upper class. In other words, the upper class was becoming extremely rich and the poor was becoming extremely poor. And the gap between rich and poor got so wide during the Hosni Mubarak era that it was impossible to control. And this is one of the reasons why you had the Arab uprising in Egypt. And that's why President Mubarak was thrown in jail, basically, because of the corruption. Um, and his sons too, his two sons also were thrown in jail for the simple reason because his sons were given a lot of power, especially in the economic department. In other words, they were the ones who were pretty much taking um, a lot of the development projects in Egypt. And that's, something that can't be done in a lot of countries. But in Egypt, it's something that easily done simply because you're the son of the president, then, you own the country basically, and you can do whatever you want. And this is something, of course, that the Egyptian people didn't like. And for that reason, you had this Arab uprising in Egypt, which obviously ended the reign of Hosni Mubarak. So Hosni Mubarak um, era really was not something to be proud of, basically. Um, his legacy, basically, is one that is not something that Egyptians would be very proud of or would really put him up to or compare him basically with President Nasser. So if you compare President Nasser, when President Nasser died, he died a poor man. And, his kids were never involved in politics. And, just to give you this something that happened during President Nasser, he had a daughter that she wanted to go to medical school. But in order to go to medical school, you have to get a certain grade, if you will. In other words, it has to be above 80% uh, overall from high school. And she did not get that. She got, I think, about 78 or 76, somewhere around there. So she was short of 80% to get to medical school. Now, a lot of the officials there, they encouraged her. They said, "Oh, no problem. You can go in, and you're the daughter of the president. Who's going to tell you no?" And when President Nasser heard about that, he said, "No way. Over my dead body, she goes to medical school. She can't because she didn't get the right grade. And if she goes in, that simply means that we have to take somebody out. And that's not right, and it's not fair." And so, she ended up going to engineering school instead of going to medical school. This is really tells you how President, he was a very simple man. He was not, as I said, when he died, he was not rich. He did not leave anything to his kids. Um, he didn't even have a car, basically. So when he died, he didn't have a car because the cars that he used were government cars. But when he died, he had no car, basically. So, there's a huge difference between President Nasser, President Sadat, and President Mubarak. President Sadat obviously lived the high life, I guess. He was very extravagant and he was very corrupt. The same thing with Hosni Mubarak, very extravagant, very corrupt, him and his family, basically. But with President Nasser, his family was very simple, normal. They never, were involved in political life. They were not involved in the economic life of the country. They were simply professionals. Most of them were engineers, and they had their own profession. They worked for certain companies. They were never involved in politics. Whereas with President Sadat and President Mubarak, their families were pretty much involved in the political process. So, there's a lot of corruption, but with Nasser, you don't find that. And that's the reason why President Nasser is pretty much respected till today. So many people respect him for that reason, because he was very simple, normal human being, even though he was the leader, but he was not extravagant. Small house, etc. So, he never took any money and put it in his pocket or in his bank accounts. As I said, he died poor. So that's was the reason why people all over the Arab world. In fact, when I was born, my mom named me after him. That's why my name is Nasser, basically. I was named after President Nasser of Egypt. So, yeah, that tells you the difference between those three presidents, I guess. Now with Sisi, I don't know. I really don't have. There isn't much to say about Sisi now because it's too early. We still need time to see his approach that he will take in as far as developing the economy. But so far, from what I see, I think he's moving in the right direction. I think Egypt has really changed. The economy has pretty much been revamped by Sisi. So you see huge buildings everywhere. You see that he has paid a lot of attention to agriculture and to manufacturing at the same time. So he did not neglect either. Um, Trade with trade, he's still opening doors for a lot of people to trade with other countries. So he's really moving on all cylinders, if you will. And I think from an economic standpoint, he's doing extremely well. And from the political standpoint, I think he's bringing a lot of political stability. Mohammed Morsi, who actually took over from and Mohammed Morsi is a Muslim Brotherhood, but he won elections fair and square in Egypt. But obviously, he was toppled by Sisi because Sisi felt that Morsi was taking the country in the wrong direction, and the economy was being mismanaged by the Muslim Brotherhood, and that's the reason why. Um, Sisi put Mohammed Morsi aside and took over. But again, Sisi took over also in a freely elected environment. In other words, he went through elections, and the people actually wanted Sisi to um, take over from Morsi, basically. So he was pretty much elected by a huge margin. Um, And as I said, right now Egypt is moving in the right direction, at least from the economic, political, and social point of view. It's making strides. Now, how advanced are these strides? This is, a question that remains to be answered because as far as poverty is concerned, yeah, the poverty is still there. High rates of poverty still remain in Egypt. And nothing has been done in the distribution of income either. So something has to be done there as well, um, redistributing income and making sure that the gap is not that wide between the rich and the poor. So I guess Sisi has a lot of work on his hands. Nothing is accomplished yet, but at least he's moving in the right direction. At least he's hitting on the right buttons in as far as economic development is concerned, which is good. Now, the resistance. Why do we have resistance to reform? Why are countries in the MENA region resisting reform? Well, there are many reasons, of course, for resisting these reforms. Like, for example, by the end of the 1980s, you could see that the process of state-led intervention has come to a standstill. In other words, the state has done pretty much everything that it could. So by the end of the 1980s, there wasn't really anything that the state can do, which it had not done. So it pretty much came to a standstill. Well, this, of course, meant that state capitalism is going to be pretty much weakened when the state starts to lose power and when the state starts to lose dominance. State capitalism would become very weak. In other words, it would be weakened. Now, this weakening of state capitalism is obviously going to affect a lot of the salaried managers who are actually working in the SOEs, state-owned enterprises. And once these reform take place, a lot of these SOEs will be privatized, and a lot of these managers will probably lose their positions, lose their jobs. And as we said before, the government jobs are the most attractive in the MENA region. Why? Because they pay very well and they have a lot of benefits. So everyone wants to have a government job. Now, obviously, with the weakening of the state and the weakening of state capitalism and state bourgeoisie, also the state bourgeoisie now become threatened as a result of the reforms. So this was one of the main reasons why you had this resistance to the reform. So a lot of these people, what they tried to do, they were obviously trying to rationalize state intervention. They were saying, well, wait a minute, let's not take this too far. Let's not take this economic reforms too far. I mean, the state needs to be here. The state has a major role to play. So they were trying to rationalize state intervention. in order to escape this whole reform business. And they said that all what we need to do is simply make the state more efficient. If we can do that, then we really don't have to make any drastic reforms. So let's make the state more efficient. And they felt that if economic liberalization were to be introduced, this would simply mean that the private sector has to take control. And they were saying, is the private sector ready to do that? So this was the question that they were posing. Okay, if we go with all these reforms, if we go with all this economic liberalization, this means that the private sector must be at the forefront. In other words, the private sector must take the lead. Now, they were actually questioning the private sector's ability to actually take over. And they said, well, the private sector is not ready. So let's not jump very quickly to this so-called economic reforms. Organized labor was also a staunch opponent of reforms. Why? Because, again, of the high salaries and benefits that their members were enjoying by being employees of the government. So you can see from this that it was extremely difficult to put this structural reforms in place simply because of this huge resistance that it found. Now, obviously, structural reforms, as we all know, will include such things as downsizing the government by restraining public expenditure, reducing the size of public enterprise, and also removing subsidies on consumer goods, agricultural goods, and also reducing tariffs on imports, basically. I'm sorry, putting tariffs on imports. Now, if you want to liberalize the economy, you have to take those tariffs out. And this would simply mean that by obviously taking tariffs out, you're going to be leaving your domestic industry open to competition. And as a result, a lot of people may actually lose their jobs. So all these opponents are saying, well, do you want this to happen? Do you want all these problems to actually take place? And if so, are you ready to actually handle these problems? So, they were putting a lot of questions, and they were giving a lot of reasons why the government should really not hasten to embark on this so-called structural reforms. In fact, they felt that it's a lot safer to go with the status quo for now until we can actually put policies in place that can address all of the problems and issues that we will confront once we embark on structural reforms. So, that's basically the reason why countries were pretty much not very excited to embark on structural reforms. But at the end, of course, and one more thing, they said that, well, with economic reforms, you're going to have social upheavals. You're going to have a lot of political instability. You're going to have riots. Now, are you ready for such events? Because with riots and social upheavals, that could destroy the economy. That could destroy the infrastructure. which would mean that we have to start all over again. So what we have done for the past 10 years or 12 years under ISI will be completely lost. So do you really want to still embark on structural reform and adjustments? So, all of these are legitimate questions, of course, but that does not mean that simply because this is going to involve all these problems and all these issues and all these negative outcomes, that means we should continue to pursue the status quo. That's not an answer. The answer is, okay, you know what the problems are, you know what the issues are, then what you need to do is you really need to start implementing the right policies to be able to address these questions and these issues. In other words, you want to become prepared and you want to try and manage the economy in a way that will put the economy on the right track toward economic prosperity and social development. So those are the things that these countries need to do. And in fact, a lot of countries pretty much had no choice but to embark on structural adjustment and economic reforms. They did it late, of course, but they had to do it because they had no other choice. Now, obviously, it was a lot easier done in some countries than it was in others. In other words, those countries that happen to be rich, a lot of resources, were able to make the adjustments pretty smoothly, whereas those countries that happen to be overpopulated, not so many resources, obviously those reforms were very painful. Now, some have said that the Arab uprising came as a result of the structural adjustments that was pushed upon these countries. I pretty much disagree. And the reason why I disagree with that is because the structural adjustments started basically in the late 1990s. And the Arab Spring started in 2011. So if there was any reaction to the structural adjustment, it should have come immediately after it. In other words, probably 3-4 years down the road, I would expect to see problems arising, but in fact, it didn't. All these problems arose in 2011, way after a lot of these countries were pretty much enmeshed into the economic reforms. So I really don't see any relationship between the structural adjustments, economic reforms that were undertaken by these countries and the Arab uprising. I think the Arab uprising, the main reason for that was simply because of the accumulation of the social injustice and economic inequality that prevailed in a lot of these countries, that finally it blew up. In other words, people were no longer able to accept the dire conditions, economic conditions that they were living in. And they felt, hey, that we need to take things into our own hands because we have given these leaders enough time, and these leaders really have not shown any progress whatsoever. So we have to take things into our own hands. And that's exactly what happened. So it all started in Tunis, as I'm sure most of you know, with one college graduate who does not have any job. He could not get a job with the government. He could not get a job in the private sector. So he was left all alone to take care of his own financial needs, I guess. And as a result, he tried to do that. He tried to, have a small no, I wouldn't say a small business, but he had a cart with some goods that he would take from one neighborhood to another, try to sell them, make some profit, make some money, and he was also prevented from doing that because he did not have a license to do that, a government license, a business license to be able to sell uh, in the streets as a peddler, and as a result, he really felt that things are not going his way, and he just lost all hope basically, and he burned himself. Now, once he burned himself and everyone knew about it, now people obviously in the Middle East are extremely emotional. They are very, very emotional, more emotional than any other people that I have seen. And they pretty much sided with this poor guy who really didn't have any choice but to burn himself. And, it's just spread all over the MENA region in those countries that were ruled by dictators, especially countries that were rich but were not doing very well. And the reason why, because of corruption and because of wasta and because of political leaders and their families and um, their inner circles are the ones that get all the benefits and the rest pretty much get nothing. This is what I mean when I talk about the maldistribution of income. Whereas income happens to be going to a very, very small percentage of the people, and the rest, they really have nothing. So, you can't run economies and countries based on this type of income distribution. You have to be more fair, you have to be just, you have to give opportunities to everyone equally, and you have to invest in education, you have to invest in health, you have to invest in infrastructure, you have to create more jobs, in other words, make people feel that they are needed, that they are contributing, that they are doing something worthwhile. All of this is extremely important to development. And unfortunately, a lot of these countries care less about the poverty of their people, what their people are going through. As long as they're doing fine, their family is doing fine, their inner circles are doing fine. In other words, the ones who are at the top, then everyone else really doesn't matter that much. And this is wrong. This is the wrong policies to use. And unfortunately, a lot of the Arab countries seem to be taking this route, and as a result, you would expect to see a lot of these social upheavals in these Arab countries, and it will continue. By the way, I don't think we have reached the end. It's just it has calmed down a little bit, but I think given time, it will start to reappear. Because as long as these leaders, they don't have the interest of their people at heart, and they don't work very hard for their people, things will continue to be sour for those countries. So again, this ends this chapter, I guess. That's all that you really need to know. And as far as this chapter is concerned, the fall and the rise of the state and structural adjustment reforms, the resistance to structural reforms, all of that is pretty much important. And I hope you have gained something from what we have done in as far as this chapter is concerned. I hope I have shed some light on what goes on in a lot of these Arab countries, the problems, the challenges, the weaknesses, the ineffective policies, whether they are economic or developmental policies, the unclear development trajectories for all of these countries. All of this really makes a difference to how countries in the MENA region are expected to move forward. As long as these countries are not taking care of these type of issues and you know, putting a lot of effort to actually find the right solutions and to actually know what the problems are, what the real issues are, and try to address them effectively and efficiently. I don't think that there would be any hope for these countries in the MENA region. It will just continue as usual, and they will continue to be mirrored in poverty. And unfortunately, that's my perspective. If there is no change in political leadership, and when I say change in political leadership, I don't mean replacing the present leadership with those who are very similar to them. I really mean making real changes, putting the right people in the right places, putting people who have a vision, people who have social responsibility, people who don't care much about themselves, but they care about the overall social good. These are the type of leaders we need. People with vision, leaders with vision, leaders with empathy, leaders that really want to do something, leaders that want to make real changes. Um, Again, it's a lot easier said than done, but unfortunately, this is where we are right now. And I don't know. Does anyone have any comments or any questions for the 3 minutes that we have left?
I have a quick question.
Yes.
You know how you said Egypt suffered a lot of consequences after signing the peace agreement with Israel?
Mm-hmm.
Did Jordan have to go through similar things or not?
Yes, absolutely. Jordan went through the same thing. In fact, if you look at Jordan and Egypt, these two countries that actually signed a peace agreement with Israel, in fact, nothing changed basically. We're back to square one. I mean, they really have not benefited that much from the peace agreement that they signed with Israel. Nor has Israel benefited from the peace agreement that they signed with Egypt and Jordan. In other words, as long as you don't get the people involved in signing those peace agreements, in other words, you have to have them on board. If you don't have that, then, I don't care how many peace agreements you sign, it's really not going to make a dent. So a peace agreement does not mean a piece of paper that you and we sign and we say, okay, we're not going to go into war with one another. That's not a peace agreement. The peace agreement is basically getting the people to actually respect one another and getting people actually to work with one another, to exchange ideas with one another, to exchange goods with one another. That's what we mean by peace. And this really has not happened between Israel and Egypt and Jordan, and it will never happen. And I guess I gave you the reasons why. I don't know if you remember them or not, but I told you exactly the reason why this is not going to happen. As long as the Palestinians that live inside Israel are not given their full rights as citizens, the Arab people will never have peace with Israel. Never. It's not going to happen. So Israel really has to, if Israel is really interested in having peace with the Arab countries, they have to do something inside Israel. They have to make reforms inside. They have to make changes inside. Once they do that, and once we can see that the Palestinians, Arab Palestinians and Jewish Palestinians, this is how I would like to call them, because to me, I mean, it's Palestine and it's not Israel. Well, this is my opinion, of course. Some may um, disagree, that's fine, but this is the way I look at it. I look at it as Palestine. And there are Jews living in Palestine, and there are Arabs living in Palestine. And as long as the Jews and Arabs are not seeing eye to eye, as long as both of these people are not respecting one another, as long as there is no justice and equality between these two, then you're never gonna have peace in the Middle East. It's as simple as that. It's not gonna happen. Now you have Israel signing peace treaty with it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because these are not signed between peoples, it's signed between leaders. And leaders are not going to make the people. Ones that make the peace is the people, not the leaders. The leaders can't do much. They can sign pieces of paper, yes, but on the grounds, what do you have? That's what matters most. So the people really need to communicate. They need to interact with one another. They need to reach understandings. They need to respect one another. When this happens, you're going to have real peace. If this doesn't happen, I don't think, I'm just being realistic here. I know some of you may say, well, I'm an extremist here. I'm not. I'm just being realistic. I'm just reading it the way it is. Now, I may have some biases. Of course, I'm not going to ignore that because, I'm an Arab. So I do have some biases when it comes to the Arab-Israeli conflict. But besides that, I'm just trying to, say it as it is. And unfortunately, at least in my lifetime, I don't think I would be able to see peace between the Arabs and the Israelis. Very, very difficult under the given circumstances right now. It's not easy. Anyone else?
I have a question for the presentation.
Yes.
So for the first question, you asked for the effects of oil revenues. Do you want us to present in a specific country or in the region as a whole?
You can actually use a specific country. It's better.
Okay, thank you.
Gives us better information. But, taking the region as a whole, sometimes, it really doesn't give us a very good picture. But if you're specific with a specific country, you can illuminate a lot of things.
And I have a question about question number 2 for the presentations. So
Mhm.
the failure of the Arab economic integration, the missing links, would that be the structural reform and the economic reform that's been happening since the would be 60s going forward?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a lot. A lot of that has to do with it. And the other thing, of course, is that there hasn't been much regional integration. In other words, there hasn't been much integration between the different subgroups in the region, like the RRLA, RRLP, RPLA. You don't see any economic integration between them in terms of trade treaties. And this was a huge problem. So if you go to, excuse me, I think the book has a lot to say about that. If you go to chapter 13, I guess, or is it 12? I don't remember now. It talks about the trade treaties and the obstacles that a lot of these Arab countries faced when it came to signing trade treaties with one another.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Any other question?
I had a really quick question, Professor.
Yes.
So after the peace treaty, you mentioned that Egypt was banned from the Arab group. What was that group
Arab
called?
League. Arab League.
Arab League? Okay, cool.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I guess if no more questions, I will see you next time. And in the meantime, I wish you all a nice weekend
Professor,
and see you then.
Professor,
Yes.
I don't have a question, but I just want to talk to you. For the exam that I sent you an email. I was actually in New
Yeah,
York
I
City.
remember you sent me an email about you traveling to New York, I guess.
Yeah,
But
so for the submission, I couldn't submit it on the link that you posted because it was closed, but I submitted it on Canvas.
oh, no, you should not submit it on Canvas. You
Yeah,
should
I
submit
was
it
late.
on
That's why
Titanium. Yeah, Titanium.
I mean on Titanium. Okay, so should
Yeah,
I send it again on Titanium?
yeah, Titanium, not Canvas. Send it on Titanium.
Okay, I'm gonna send it to you one more time.
All right.
Professor, I have a question.
Yes.
My name isn't on the list, on the group list. Like my group's not on there.
How many of you in the group?
There's 3 of us.
Okay, so you can either choose to be the first one or the last one.
Okay.
Okay, just
All right.
it's your choice. You could either be the first one to present or the last one.
We'll be the last one.
Okay.
Then.
All right.
Do you want me to tell you? Do you want me to message you who's
Yeah,
in our group?
please. Yeah, please send me the names in your group so I can put them in.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Okay, again, I will see you on Tuesday. Have a nice weekend.